Cancun, Pablo Solom did something similar. He stood up and says, I dissent. I will not let this United Nations Framework, what is it? The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of the Parties. It's COP, Conference of the Polluters. They just said, okay, that's easy to remember. And the Philippine delegate, Yeb Sano, went on a hunger strike in 2013 in COP19. What I'm worried about is this. Do you see this picture here? This is what happened in Copenhagen. I'm very worried this is the Paris picture, the nightmare scenario in which the main polluters in the world get together, and especially under African leadership. Let's not forget that the key guy in this picture is half African. His father's Luo from Western Kenya. And the Luo and the Zulu people, this is my president, they're very, very vulnerable. And they're going to be dying like flies. And basically these leaders are sacrificing their relatives on behalf of big industrial, usually multinational corporate interests. This is called the Copenhagen Accord. And it was done by these leaders of BRICS, minus Russia, and the US, and they blew up the United Nations by having that separate meeting that agreed non-binding. Let's not have binding. This will all be voluntary. They even use the phrase bottom up. Bottom up. That's from the Obama people came out. That'll be a 4-degree increase. What it showed was that there's a structural problem in these climate negotiations when we get these delegates, like the South Africans, who are so strongly influenced by mining houses, the energy-intensive users group. And what they're doing is coming to negotiations to negotiate, let's just raise the ceiling, because we all need to emit more. And this kind of pressure to make more emissions rather than to put the ceiling on and to lower it is so evident, right, in the structural self-interest of states whose delegates are coming to represent the interests of their fossil fuel and industrial polluters. And we've seen that again and again up close, where South Africa then hosted the 2011 COP, the COP17, and we don't know what the deals were done. That's our foreign minister, Maite Nkoana-Mashabane, and Hillary Clinton is the Secretary of State. Somebody's laughing in that picture. Somebody's getting applauded for doing a deal that will lead to 180 million African deaths. So that's the Durban Declaration that came out, and it basically evaporates the difference between the rich countries and the poor countries. It puts everybody in the same basket. What it really did, according to the Financial Times, was also financialize and commodify climate. It privatized the air, because like the European Union emissions trading scheme and the Kyoto Protocol, the Durban Declaration was a Viagra shot. What? That's what it's described by Abid Karnali, the global head of carbon markets at Bank of America. It's like the Viagra shot for the flailing carbon markets, the carbon markets where you can buy and sell the right to pollute. Okay, some of the men in the room, you know, these little pills, they don't last very long, do they? Maybe a few hours. Okay, so the carbon markets crashed again, right? Okay, a little tiny, pickup. But then the carbon markets are down to 3, 4, 5 euros. They were at 30, right? You can just see this big crash. But there's a revival effort for Paris. So I would warn you that this is going to be one of the terrains of struggle. Should we solve the climate crisis by bringing in the most powerful people in the world to fix this problem? Right? And I'm talking, of course, of bankers. And you don't like bankers in this country, I think. Why would we let them fix the climate? They can't even fix their own financial market. So this carbon market strategy, the commodification that the EU has been the pioneer of promoting, and that have pushed clean development mechanism projects all over the BRICS countries. South Africa's had some disasters. So we've done a little survey of these CDMs, clean development mechanisms. They really cannot deliver the money. And we've been thinking instead we need to raise the problem of the liability, not funding CDM scams, but asking guys like this, the main negotiator for the US, about the climate debt that is owed by the rich northern countries and the northern people, because I live in the global north myself in South Africa. What is our climate debt? For Todd Stern, the sense of guilt or culpability or reparations, I just categorically reject that. So economists in the room know that's the polluter pays principle. They're throwing out the most simple way to reform economics from within, internalizing externalities. And what we know, thank goodness for Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning and Snowden, we know from the WikiLeaks files about the State Department cables that revealed people like Meles Zenawi, the late dictator of Ethiopia, killed so many hundreds of his a students and democracy activist, that he went to Copenhagen and cut his demand on half after visiting Sarkozy, and then the US shook him down some more. That's all revealed. As was the Maldives, a great group of negotiators. I know one of you, I know the environment minister in that picture. This is the famous picture where they were having their cabinet meeting in scuba gear because their island is shrinking, is sinking, right? But they were for $50 million, on Sala for projects that were promised but were never delivered. They made a U-turn on the Copenhagen Accord. They were against it and then they supported it. So a moment of solidarity, because around the world there's an awareness of climate now. This is the latest Pew Center report in July, showing that it's the #1 concern, economic vulnerability the second. Who owes the climate debt? Who should be in solidarity? These countries. There's one there, South Africa. And we owe a climate debt. We've had more than our fair share of emissions. Here are the places that are incredibly vulnerable. And Africa is the obviously hardest hit, with the inland areas maybe going up to 6, 7 degrees. And look at the places where the US Defense Department, they're very worried about instability coming from climate, like Darfur or Syria, right? And these sites of climate instability are just exactly where the extractive industries have been so active in the Great Lakes region, northern Uganda, Darfur, and Sudan, and then out in West Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia. So these sites of extractive industry looting and civil war will be hit again, increasingly by climate change. That's why this changes everything. And Naomi Klein's book last year helps us to very quickly sum up with challenges. A challenge to say something that Jeffrey Sachs, Joe Stiglitz, James Robinson, all of our resource-cursed experts won't say. This changes everything. In other words, climate change forces us not to modify the system, or to be frank, just like the Kimberley process, which failed the Zimbabweans, not to put on corporate social responsibility or US-style Dodd-Frank or Ruggie principles, but to question the mode of production. The mode of production, the deep changes required shouldn't be viewed as punishments, Naomi Klein writes, but a kind of gift. It's time to stop running from the implications of climate change. This changes everything. Climate forces us to rethink our energy systems, to move to renewables, to rethink our transport, to move to both public transport and localized production systems, to move to a more compact and compressed version of human settlements, the urban form instead of the suburban sprawl, to have housing and services that are sociologically accountable, and agriculture and food systems that are organic, not based on fossil fuel fertilizer and pesticides, production systems that can go from multinational corporate capitalist logic to eco-social planning, consumption systems that would promote eco-socially sound consumption norms and decommodify basic needs guarantees, and disposal systems that go from planned obsolescence to zero waste, health, education, arts and social policy, social and private space. Everything can be put into a motion for transformation if we use this lens. Again, with so many people in motion the last period, economic justice, anti-austerity protests, I'll just conclude with what I think our debate in South Africa is opening up. I mean, this week we had thousands of people protesting corruption at the Johannesburg Chamber of Mines and local government offices, the Reserve Bank, and the stock market. 2 weeks ago we had a similar protest. I mean, every week things are now beginning to be put into a bigger frame. So I think what you've done in Cyprus should teach us your emergency defense mechanism against financial looting in April 2013 is something we need to do as a precautionary measure. And that would be one of the questions I'd love to pose to all of you. What were the lessons before we go over that financial cliff that I showed you? We need lower interest rates, and to do that we have to have exchange controls, otherwise the money all floods out. And then we need to ask, well, how much of that $150 billion in debt should we pay? And what is about this De Beers and all the other companies that take the money illegally away? And what kind of industrial policy can import substitute in an eco-sustainable way and rebalance the economy and meet social needs? How much more money do we have for increasing state social spending, since we have the most unequal country in the world? Our Gini coefficient, by the way, the World Bank measured last November, is 0.77. 0.77, right? That's, one is where one person owns everything. 0 is everybody shares. So it's the highest amongst major countries. And we need to therefore cross-subsidize at every opportunity, maybe have quantitative easing, printing the money to do so, reorient the infrastructure spending, hundreds of billions of dollars now being proposed, even nuclear. But we still have huge unmet basic needs. The energy grid, sanitation, public transport clinics. And one way to do that is the so-called Million Climate Jobs campaign that one of our sister institutes, AIDC.org.za, AIDC is promoting, and a genuinely green just transition. I think because I like this Cyprus strategy of taking the money that came in and locking it in. I like the way, in a way, that John Maynard Keynes, so, you think I'm way, way too radical. But Keynes actually put this really well, didn't he? There are some things we should minimize, not maximize in terms of the economic entanglement. Ideas, knowledge, science, hospitality, travel, solidarity. Actually, that's not on the list because he was a Cambridge elitist, but anyway, solidarity. These are the things which should, of their nature, be international. Let goods be homespun whenever it's reasonably and conveniently possible. And above all, let finance be primarily national. Don't let those bankers run wild. In fact, he said very clearly the whole management of a domestic economy depends upon the control you have of your money, your interest rates, and capital controls is a corollary to that, right? Maybe you're thinking about lifting those controls. I'll send you these books. Actually, I already did. So I very much thank you for allowing me a little extra time, and I'd love to hear your feedback.
Thanks very much. It was a fantastic presentation, very comprehensive. Now, I'm going to take I think I'm going to have like a small comment, and I'm going to have a question time if anybody wants to chip in. And now, I have the national accounting principle is fantastic, but in the structure of justice, I mean, we say, oh, the law has to change. The Stiglitz, Jeffrey Sachs sort of situation, saying, oh, just twinkle the system. The system will work if you just play with it.
Transparency, if you shine a sharp light on the corruption, it will be disinfected.
Exactly.
No problem.
Yeah, but you're saying, no, actually, that the problem is much, much deeper. We need to try to change the structure. One thing that I've seen that is the implication of what we are saying, which is basically leave it on the ground, is that either innovation has to occur, so that, because right now, the global system of trade, this is what was fueling the world economy, right? So I am Cyprus, I have a consumption, I have money to spend, so I will import the people will meet my means. So what we are saying here is basically we need to change the consumption behavior as well from the global north, because if you have the demand for the product, big companies are going to find the way to extract materials. I mean, and the second point is that the commodity prices have crashed. And because they have crashed, it has brought up those issues, right? Do you think that this is going to be it's going to stay low? And because if it rebounds, it will probably give some money back to the South African, and then they can stymie those reforms. Okay.
Should I just very quickly, I can very, very quickly reply that the last question is so terribly important because tens of thousands of jobs are being lost, and we don't want to have illusions that they can be regained, that somehow China will recover miraculously, and that the huge demand that they've experienced for, especially, I'll give you one example, steel, which we smelt from our iron ore, and we've always exported it to China. But the overproduction problem, Marxists call this overaccumulation of capital, is so severe now that the inflow of steel from China, because they've built up more of their own productive capacity, has just wrecked our second largest company. Actually, you know the man who's owned it, Abramovich, who owns Chelsea, and he's just shut it down last week. It went into effective bankruptcy. It was bought by kind of a fly-by-night company, it looks like, from Hong Kong a couple of days ago. So some very interesting problems that are witnessed in this incredible volatility in metals. And The response from my dear friends in the metal workers is logical. We need protection against those Chinese inflows. That can be dangerous. Our South African working class has a xenophobic tendency, right? And there's also what we could call it a yellow peril, a fear that the Chinese economy will, in its desperation, now just swamp everything. And the Chinese, there are about 1 million Chinese in Africa. I think in Zambia you've seen protests against Chinese, right? Against cheap Chinese products, against Chinese immigrant workers. So we need to find solidarity with Chinese workers who are in the same boat, right? And the inflows are responded to logically as a first gut reaction with a demand for protectionism. So last month, the Trade and Industry Minister, who's actually a communist, put on a 10% tariff on Chinese steel, and that has given a little bit of space. So it's a very intense period to deal with the incredible declines, 50% plus declines in commodity prices from the peak of 2011. You know that in 2008, they crashed so fast, but then they rebounded. So they crashed on average tin and platinum, they lost 60, 70%, but they've kind of rebounded and kept rising until 2011. But this super cycle and the inability of bankers, even a BRICS New Development Bank, to find projects that can pay off, mean I think a lot of that wasted investment in infrastructure for mining the neo-colonial systems that are being planned, $93 billion a year of fantasy infrastructure projects. Like the biggest development project in the world is a $100 billion dam on the Congo River, right? The Inga hydropower project that's supposed to export electricity to Italy, probably here too, and to Cape Town. Now that's the sort of fantasy of mega projects that the commodity boom allowed the World Bank, Chinese, US planners to begin. Now they can't do it, I'm sure. So I think, yes, we're probably in a stagnant era, and that gives us the space to say, with the commodity prices low, we're not even getting anything back, and we're having to deal with companies that are going to go bankrupt and leave huge environmental liabilities. Let's rethink, and that means getting that 1 million climate jobs, getting our metal workers out of the aluminium smelters, which are so highly subsidized with PHP Dilaton, and getting them maybe with their smelting and welding skills into producing renewable energy, putting the solar panels along and building the turbines that we desperately need. And then the earlier question, whether the natural capital accounting runs into problems. I should have mentioned, to be fair, I did say that it's controversial. And the real question is whether, as I mentioned, you take your natural capital accounting and you privatize the product, nature, and you sell it to the highest bidder. Is that the logic of counting the world? That's the World Bank's agenda, obviously. And they're promoting carbon trading as the most extreme example. But when we had this debate last year at the University of Pretoria, we had a guest from India, Vandana Shiva, and we began to probe the strategic use of these lines of argument with Vandana, and she was very clear with us. Look, she said, don't allow your natural capital accounting to give the impression that once you've counted, you simply can generate more effective markets with more market information, sort of Stiglitz position. Because the markets, when you hand them over to bankers, right, like Goldman Sachs, very key in setting up the carbon markets, just go crazy. They're not efficient and effective. They're speculative bubbles, and they're full of criminals, banksters, right? So instead, we could think about this natural capital accounting in the way I presented, which is, it just doesn't make sense to extract minerals if you're net negative. Use natural capital accounting, therefore, as a stop sign. Say, stop, wait, think. Are you really doing the right thing for your national economy? Because every one of those struggles I showed you has a spiritual, political, social, gender, an ecological component. What I think natural capital accounting now adds, even endorsed by the World Bank, is the acknowledgement that this does not make economic sense either. It's only enriching a few jerks with power. Does that make sense? So stop sign, not a green light.
Anybody else has a question and wants to pose? I think we can...
I've used a lot of your time.
Thank you very much for the presentation again. So, and I'm going to have the presentations anyway if anybody wants to check them out. Now, we're supposed to have a coffee break. I don't know if you want to have a coffee break or just... Yes, okay, yes, we're going to have a coffee break and then come back in like 10 minutes.
No podemos ir.